1771 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, Volume 3, page 887. It sits there as a heavy, leather-bound testament to the peak of the Enlightenment, an era we are told was defined by the rigorous cataloguing of the known world. For years, I accepted the narrative provided by my formal education, that the vast stretches of northern Asia and the Americas were primitive, lawless wildernesses until Western expansion brought civilization to the frontier. I didn't question it. I assumed our historical maps were a linear progression from ignorance to clarity. Then, I started looking at the letter T in that specific 1771 entry more carefully. Under the heading of Tartaria, the Britannica does not describe a scattered collection of nomadic tribes or a power vacuum. It describes a genuine geographic and political entity spanning the entire Northern Hemisphere and labels it, quite explicitly, the greatest country in the world. Once I saw that designation, I couldn't stop looking for the moment it vanished. The official record suggests that a civilization of this magnitude simply faded into the backdrop of the 19th century, replaced by the rise of modern Russia and the British Empire. We are taught to believe in a natural succession of states, yet the physical evidence suggests a far more abrupt and organized displacement. To understand the scale of what may have been erased, we have to reconcile the sophisticated, resonant architecture found from Moscow to San Francisco with the primitive tools we are told were used to build them. I want to be precise here. The conventional timeline requires us to believe that horse and buggy societies managed to construct monolithic star forts and domed cathedrals that defy our modern understanding of urban planning and energy. Hold that image of the 1771 map in your mind. If the most respected reference work in European history recognized a global superpower that has since been scrubbed from every modern curriculum, we have to ask a question that mainstream academia seems entirely uninterested in answering. A civilization of that scale does not simply fade into the mist of time. It is either absorbed or it is deliberately dismantled. We are going to trace the actual candidates who possessed both the motive and the institutional means to overwrite the memory of the human race. Who was the king's grandfather really, and whose palace was he actually squatting in? To find the first candidate for this erasure, we must look toward the massive, marshy expanse of the Neva River in 1703. Official history tells a triumphant story of Peter the Great, a visionary leader who dragged a backward Russia into the modern age by sheer force of will. We are told he built St. Petersburg from nothing, importing Western architects and Western thought to replace the primitive structures of the old world. I want to be careful here. The traditional narrative isn't just about progress, it is about a total cultural pivot, but the timeline suggests a different possibility. While Peter was purportedly laying the first stones of his window to the west, Tartaria was still appearing on contemporary maps as a sovereign, sophisticated entity. If we look at the architecture of St. Petersburg, the massive granite monoliths, the Greco-Roman facades, the precision of the urban grid, we are asked to believe it was all achieved in a swamp by peasants with hand tools in a matter of decades. It raises a question that feels increasingly difficult to ignore. Was Peter building a new capital, or was he renovating an existing one? Let me say that again more slowly. The Romanov dynasty may not have been creating a new Russia, but systematically reframing the territory of an older, more advanced one. He moved the capital, commissioned a brand new historical narrative, and effectively edited out any memory of the Tartarian world that came before. Hold that detail of the imported history in your mind, because the Romanovs weren't the only ones suddenly obsessed with redrawing their borders and rewriting their lineage. The pattern suggests that a clean founding narrative wasn't just a Russian luxury, it was a structural necessity for every emerging power in Europe. But as the Romanovs were busy overwriting the map of the East, a different institution was already at work on the spiritual and architectural map of the West. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. This research depends on those willing to look past the sanitized version of our past. Now, back to the physical evidence, because the Romanovs were only one piece of a much larger convergence. As the archives in Moscow were being purged, a much older vault in Rome was becoming the silent custodian of a very different set of secrets. The official history of the Catholic Church is one of endurance, claiming that the sprawling cathedrals and domed basilicas across Europe were the labor of centuries, built by medieval stonecutters using rudimentary pulleys and faith. We are taught that these structures were designed solely for worship, their acoustics and soaring arches intended only to elevate the soul. I want to be careful here. I am not suggesting that faith didn't play a role in their history, but the physical evidence suggests these buildings may have had a primary function that had nothing to do with religion. When we examine the resonant properties of these structures, the specific geometric ratios, the use of conductive metals in the spires, and the alignment with natural energy flows, the ecclesiastical explanation begins to break down. If Tartaria was a civilization that mastered atmospheric energy, then the church didn't build these structures, it inherited them. By rebranding these advanced civic hubs as medieval religious sites, the Vatican effectively claimed a cultural and spiritual monopoly over technology it may not have fully understood. Let me say that again more slowly. The spiritual tradition we've been given might just be a cover story for the occupation of an existing energy grid. If you're finding this investigation worth your time, consider subscribing. This series goes places most channels won't touch. Now back to the coordination of this silence, because while the church was sanitizing the architecture of the West, the British Empire was moving to redefine the very boundaries of the East. We see the Romanovs in Russia, the Vatican in Europe, and the British in Asia all arriving at the same conclusion at the same time. The old world had to be erased to make room for the new. Three institutions, no shared communication, all suppressing the same category of information. But even as they redrew the maps, they realized they couldn't just hide the buildings, they had to hide the people. Official history frames the 18th and 19th centuries as the Age of Discovery, a period where the British Crown and the East India Company brought order to the empty spaces of the map through meticulous cartography and trade. We are taught that the British were simply filling in the blanks of a primitive world, establishing borders where none supposedly existed to create the modern nation-state. I want to be careful here. The official record presents this as a logistical necessity for global progress. But the evidence suggests the British were not discovery explorers, but celestial surveyors of a grand liquidation. While the Romanovs moved the capital in the east, the British East India Company was aggressively reclassifying the vast territories of Tartaria as wasteland or unclaimed. By the time of the Great Trigonometrical Survey in 1802, the British were essentially redrawing the world to fit a narrative where the sophisticated infrastructure already on the ground simply didn't exist. Let me say that again more slowly. The borders of our modern world may not have been drawn to include people, but to exclude the memory of a civilization that was already there. Remember that detail about the scale of the operation. Erasing a continent requires more than just new maps. It requires a new way of thinking. Three institutions, the Russian throne, the Romanovs, and the British Crown, all arriving at the same silence, redrawing the same regions, and erasing the same predecessor. It was an ecosystem of reinforcing interests where the incentive was not truth, but control. But maps are only paper. To truly seal the tomb of a civilization, you have to control the minds of the next generation. The task fell to a different kind of architect, the academic gatekeepers who were about to build a fortress around what we are allowed to call history. The official record presents the 19th century as the birth of modern historical methodology, an era when German universities, particularly in Berlin and Göttingen, developed the rigorous frameworks we still use to document the human story. We are taught that these academics were the first to apply a truly scientific lens to the past, separating myth from verifiable record. I want to be careful here. The intellectual rigor of these institutions was real, but the evidence suggests that this science had a specific, built-in bias. These frameworks privileged written European records over the physical evidence of the landscape, creating a linear model of progress that moved conveniently from primitive tribes to the rise of Western civilization. Within this rigid model, the existence of a vast, advanced empire covering the Eurasian steppe was not just unlikely, it was structurally impossible. To admit that Tartaria existed would be to dismantle every career every textbook, and every philosophical justification for European dominance. Let me say that again more slowly. The academic establishment didn't necessarily conspire in secret. They simply excluded any data that contradicted their own survival. If these patterns are raising questions you haven't seen raised elsewhere, consider sharing this work. The deeper this scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes to ignore. Now back to the institutional incentives, because this was the final seal on the tomb. A young historian in 1850 had every professional reason to work within the accepted framework and no reward for challenging it. We see the pattern again. The Romanovs provided the new land, the church provided the new spiritual justification, and the academics provided the intellectual fortress to make the erasure permanent. But even as they sanitized the maps and the books, they were hiding a much more dangerous reality, the source of the power itself. To find the ultimate motive, we have to follow the money into the smoke of the Industrial Revolution. Official history presents the Industrial Revolution as a spontaneous explosion of human ingenuity, where the discovery of coal and steam suddenly liberated mankind from the limits of the natural world. We are taught that this transition was an inevitable step in our evolution, led by visionary financiers and inventors who built the foundation of our modern economy. I want to be careful here. The technological leap was undeniably real, but the evidence suggests that what we call the birth of industry may have actually been the replacement of an existing paradigm. If Tartarian architecture was indeed designed to harness free atmospheric energy, using the resonant principles and conductive spires we've already observed, then the introduction of a fossil fuel economy wasn't just a business move. It was a strategic necessity to ensure that power could be metered, controlled, and sold. Let me say that again more slowly. The financial elite may have dismantled the history of an advanced civilization because its very existence proved that energy could be free. The timing is almost too precise. The global disappearance of Tartaria from the record aligns perfectly with the rise of the central banking dynasties and the massive infrastructure shifts toward combustion. For the emerging industrial class, the prior civilization was not just a curiosity, it was an existential threat to the entire economic model of scarcity. Hold that detail of the energy shift in your mind, because it provides the ultimate motive for why the maps had to be redrawn and the buildings renamed. Three separate forces, the political, the spiritual, and the financial, all arriving at the same conclusion. The old world had to be erased to make their version of the future possible. But this brings us back to the most difficult question of all. How did so many different factions coordinate such a massive deception without a single leak? To understand that, we have to look past the idea of a secret society and look at the invisible architecture of the system itself. The conventional explanation for such a monumental shift in history is often dismissed as a logistical impossibility. We are told that a conspiracy of this scale would require thousands of individuals across centuries to keep a perfect, whispered secret. The official record suggests that institutions are too fractured and human nature too prone to leaking for a global cover-up to ever truly take hold. I want to be careful here. The idea of a single room full of villains pulling every string is a comforting simplification that the evidence doesn't support. Instead, the pattern suggests something far more resilient. We are not looking at a conspiracy of individuals, but a convergence of incentives. When the interests of the Russian crown, the Romanovs, the British Empire, and the financial elite all pointed toward the same outcome, the silence became the default state. None of these groups needed to explicitly coordinate because the incentive structure did the work for them. If the existence of Tartaria threatened the legitimacy of every throne, the dogma of the church, the reputation of every academic, and the profit of every industrialist, then every single one of those actors had a private, professional reason to maintain the void. Let me say that again more slowly. The erasure wasn't a project they sat down to plan. It was a natural byproduct of their own survival. Hold that image of a self-reinforcing ecosystem in your mind. This is the true coordination problem, the realization that multiple independent parties can arrive at the same silence without ever exchanging a word. It was a system where the truth simply had no market value. But as we stand among the remnants of this overwritten world, we are left to confront the most unsettling realization of all. The system that erased Tartaria didn't disappear with the 19th century. It is the very foundation of the world we currently inhabit. The pattern is now visible, a convergence of political necessity, spiritual monopoly, academic preservation, and financial control that overwritten an entire layer of human history. We have seen the Romanovs rebrand a captured inheritance. We have seen the Church claim resonant power as divine architecture. We have seen the British draw borders to exclude the past, and the academies build a fortress of linear progress to guard the gate. Finally, we followed the money into an era of metered energy and engineered scarcity. These are not separate stories. They are the reinforcing pillars of a single, global silence. I don't have the answer to how we truly recover what was lost, and I want to be honest about that. I'm simply looking at the same horizon as you, trying to reconcile the world we were taught with the one that still stands in stone and iron. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The 1771 maps that don't match the history books, the star forts on every continent, the cathedrals that function like power plants, the orphan trains and the empty cities. The silence of the archives. The question I am left with, the one that keeps me awake, is this: if the foundation of our entire modern identity is a curated replacement for something greater, what is the cost of our continued participation in the lie? If this investigation has raised questions you feel are worth asking, consider sharing your own theories or observations in the comments below. The next thread I'm pulling leads to the layers of mud and silt found beneath the foundations of our oldest modern cities, a physical record that suggests the reset wasn't just a matter of books and maps, but of earth and stone. I don't think any of us are prepared for where that ends. Tartaria was the greatest country in the world until we decided it never existed. Would you like me to begin outlining the next video regarding the physical evidence of the mud flood?